Hey YouTube, what a great day to take pictures! Have you practiced since the last video of this series on the photography basics? Remember, I taught you how to use the semi-automatic modes of your camera. I'm sure you did. And you're even starting to be good with that. A mode, S mode, no secrets for you anymore. So what can we see today? Well, to be honest, last time I didn't tell you the whole truth. Remember when I said you will have some time to switch to manual? Because the camera can't do what you want every time in semi-automatic mode? Well, you want to know more about that? Time to go deeper. Today, we are still talking about light, stops, exposure compensation, and metering modes. Let's go! Okay, before we start, the first thing we're going to do is define the stops. I've been talking about stops since, I believe, the first video, without really giving you a precise explanation. Why? Why? Because it always seems scary and complicated to the beginner, when in fact it's extremely simple. But guess what? You are not a beginner anymore. So, it is time.
It is time.
First of all, small vocabulary notion. What is called a stop? You may have heard it under the abbreviation EV, and it simply means exposure value. A stop is a unit of light measurement, but a relative unit, not an absolute one. It is the difference between two quantities of light which are not defined and can totally vary. Okay, here is an example. This is a light source. This bulb corresponds to our basic light, so it will be at 0 stop. From now on, we will use the term EV instead. So we are at 0 EV. Be careful, 0 is not a quantity here, just a starting point. If I want plus 1 EV, I will need to have 2 bulbs. To have one more EV, I have to double the previous amount of light, and therefore I will need 4 bulbs. 3 EVs, 8 bulbs. If I want to have minus 1 EV, since we can go into the negative, I just have to divide the amount of light emitted by my lamp by 2.
To sum up what a stop is, EV is the unit of measurement that we will use on each of the parameters of our camera that are used to manage exposure. Let's start with the shutter speed.
Let's start with the shutter speed. Let's say that I decide to set up my camera to expose my image for 1 second. If I want to increase my exposure by 1 EV, I will need to expose for 2 seconds. Plus 2 EV, 4 seconds. What if I have too much light? At minus 1 EV, I should be at 1/500 of a second.
Obviously, your device is much more accurate than that, and it doesn't require you to double the amount of light every time you touch a parameter. As a result, it usually increases by 1/3 of a stop or half a stop. For example, if I raise the shutter speed dial, after 1 second, you have 1.3 seconds, then 1.6 seconds, and finally 2 seconds. For the aperture, that's where things get complicated. I mean, it only gets complicated if you want to understand the mathematics behind that. Here is the problem. Between two apertures values, the illumination of the sensitive surface is not divided by 2, as we might think, but is in fact inversely proportional to the aperture. Well, I will avoid to explain mathematically why. First, because I don't understand that shit. And second, because we don't care. What we must remember is that between two apertures, we're not divided by 2, but we apply a square root of 2.
If I want to halve my exposure, and I am at an aperture of f1.4, 1.4 square root of 2 is equal to 2. At f2, I have therefore divided the amount of light by 2 compared to 1.4. I might minus 1 EV. A stop separates each of these values. Once again, your device is able to change the exposure by 1/3 of half value, so there are intermediate numbers between the principal aperture values.
Okay, your brain melt. No worries, we'll get some rest with the ISO.
ISO is the simplest. To double the exposure and increase by 1 EV, we just need to double the ISO value. If you are at ISO 100, plus 1 stop will be ISO 200, 2 EV, ISO 400, and so on. Again, your device offers you the possibility to increment by third value. Between ISO 100 and 200, for example, you can have access to ISO 125 or 160.
Be careful, when I say that your camera allows you to increment third stop, it depends on your equipment. Not all entry-level cameras do this. Well then, what do we need to understand that? Of course, you're a smart guy. You immediately find out what will be the benefits to have a precise unit of measurement. We're gonna be able to easily compensate when we modify values in manual mode.
For example, if you want more depth of field and you open your aperture, your exposure will increase by 1 EV. So to compensate and not burn your image, you will have to decrease by 1 EV elsewhere, either the ISO or the shutter speed. But now you're going to tell me, yeah, but I don't use the manual mode. You told us yourself that it's not necessarily useful and that we should prefer the semi-automatic modes.
Yeah, that's not untrue. But this is where exposure compensation comes in. How does your camera determine the exposure it needs for your image? It will first measure the tone of the scene and then try to average the values of height and low light, and will try to match all this to what is called a medium gray. You may have already heard the term 80% gray, and if it's not the case, well, no worries, it's not very important here. And since we're trying to get an average, that's why sometimes your camera is wrong. Sometimes you want to expose only a part of the scene, for example.
When you use P, S or A modes, you have the option of using exposure compensation. By making a first measurement, I will tell my camera that these values do not match me and ask it to underexpose or overexpose, incrementally changing the stops. For example, if I am in my favorite mode, the A mode, I manage my opening. If I tell it to underexpose, it will keep my aperture as I set it, but will either change the shutter speed to a faster one or decrease the ISO to correct the exposure as I want.
No need to switch to full manual mode to get the exposure you want. Fantastic, isn't it? Come on, aren't you tired of listening to me talking? Take your camera, go out and practice all this. Take a second to drop a like and a little comment. It will warm my little heart. Subscribe because there is a lot of new videos coming, and don't hesitate to share this one with anyone who finally wants to understand what the stops are in photography. See you mate, keep on creating.